¿Qué tal? ¿Apagó esto? No, no está. Pero el mío está funcionando.
Señor secretario general de la Organización de los Estados Americanos, José Miguel, señor embajador José María Argueta, representante permanente de Guatemala ante la Organización de los Estados Americanos, señores representantes permanentes y alternos que nos acompañan, señor embajador Adam Blackwell, secretario de Seguridad Multidimensional, embajador Paul Simons, secretario ejecutivo de SICAD, distinguidos panelistas, invitados todos. Queremos darles la más cordial bienvenida a la Casa de las Américas, a la Organización de los Estados Americanos. Agradecemos la presencia de todos ustedes en esta mesa redonda de políticas que hemos titulado Perspectivas multisectoriales sobre el problema de las drogas en las Américas, desafíos para reducir el encarcelamiento. Hacemos también extensivo este saludo a quienes nos acompañan vía internet y le recordamos al público que nos acompaña acá que tenemos interpretación en inglés y en español. Aquellos de ustedes que necesiten aparatos para escuchar la interpretación los pueden conseguir en la parte de atrás del...
¿Puede ser otro para esto, señor?
Esta mesa redonda tiene como objeto continuar con el amplio diálogo que se inició en la Asamblea General celebrada en Antigua Guatemala el año pasado. Y esto lo hacemos para identificar posibles caminos que nos permitan orientar las políticas de drogas en el Ministerio para los próximos años. Por este motivo hemos convocado un panel de expertos para que compartan sus puntos de vista y criterios en preparación para la Asamblea General Extraordinaria que estaremos teniendo en Guatemala el próximo 19 de septiembre. Y lo hacemos también en seguimiento para la implementación de la Declaración de Antigua Guatemala hacia una política integral para abordar el problema mundial de las drogas en las Américas. Agradecemos la presencia del secretario general, José Miguel Insulza, quien ofrecerá unas palabras de bienvenida. Luego procederemos al diálogo entre los panelistas, que será moderado por el embajador Paul Simons, el secretario ejecutivo de la SICAD. Nos acompañan en el panel el señor Jonathan Koblevsky, director de la Oficina de Políticas y Legislación del Departamento de Justicia de los Estados Unidos, su señoría Stephanie Jackson Hazley, magistrada residente del Tribunal de Tratamiento de Drogas de Kingston, en Jamaica, y miembro del programa de intercambios profesionales de la SICAD. También nos acompaña Graciela José, presidenta de Intercambios Asociación Civil, quienes como organización de la sociedad civil han liderado un trabajo con la red que trabaja en el tema y presentará las opiniones comunes alcanzadas la semana pasada en San José de Costa Rica, además de otras importantes consideraciones desde la perspectiva de la sociedad civil. Y luego tenemos a John Walsh, coordinador principal para el programa de los Andes y de políticas de drogas de la Oficina en Washington para Asuntos Latinoamericanos, mejor conocida como OENA. Luego de las exposiciones de los panelistas tendremos oportunidad para que ustedes, la audiencia, pueda hacer preguntas o comentarios y terminaremos con unas palabras de clausura por parte del embajador representante permanente de Guatemala ante la OEA, José María Argueta. Quisiera ofrecerle ahora la palabra al señor secretario general para que nos dé las palabras de bienvenida.
Distinguida embajadora, embajadores, miembros del decano, señoras y señores, estamos muy contentos de poder realizar este panel de discusión sobre uno de los temas que ha motivado en parte de la discusión que hemos tenido en este último año, un año muy fructífero en relación al tema de las drogas en las Américas. Como ustedes bien saben ya, Esto tiene su origen en la receta cumbre de las Américas, Cartagena, Colombia, en abril del 2012, en que nos encargaron a los Estados americanos un informe sobre el problema de las drogas en las Américas, pidiéndonos tanto un informe completo, abierto acerca de todo lo que ocurría en esta materia, analizando los resultados del actual político y explorando también algunos nuevos enfoques para enfrentar este fenómeno. Creo que lo que nunca se ha hecho de esta manera, hubo en Cartagena un gran consenso, casi obvio, y es que las cosas no andaban bien. Por lo tanto, también era necesario modificar políticas en una dirección que no redujera la lucha contra la droga a un tema puramente ofensivo, sino que incluyera otros enfoques que permitieran también recuperar la cantidad de personas involucradas en el tema de la droga, reducir en gran medida el grado de violencia que se producía en las comunidades, y ojalá también aprovechar innovar en materia de justicia, tratamiento médico, etc. Uno de los temas que se planteó en esta reunión, pero que ya en esta reunión de la Asamblea General de Guatemala, que la siguió, en la cual alcanzamos un conjunto de acuerdos unánimes al respecto. Uno de los temas que más se planteó fue el tema de la prisión y el problema de la realidad que vive nuestro continente, que existe una cantidad de gente que está encarcelada por problemas de drogas, incluso de posesión de drogas, de microtráfico, y que respeta las cárceles de América. En las Américas hay una cantidad cercana a los 3,5 millones de personas que están en la cárcel, y al menos 1,5 millones lo están por delitos vinculados a la droga. Y por consiguiente, este era un tema que ciertamente preocupaba a muchos y sigue preocupando. Ahora, ya en nuestra estrategia del año 2010, en las reuniones de la CICAD, este tema de las reformas judiciales o de las alternativas al encarcelamiento se encontraba. Ya estaba planteada como una posibilidad y varios países ya han decidido examinar la necesidad de adoptar medidas que permitan revertir la situación de hacinamiento y de falta de tratamiento que reciben tanto adictos como personas que delinquen, que están por delitos menores en nuestras cárceles. El tema está en la declaración de Antigua y el problema específico de la proporcionalidad de las penas es prioritario. Hemos tenido sobre esto novedades importantes, creo que las vamos a examinar acá. Creo que se ha avanzado sustantivamente tanto en los tribunales de droga como en el tema de las penas alternativas. Ha habido importantes anuncios, sin ir más lejos, en los Estados Unidos, como sabemos, el Attorney General formuló a principios de este año un conjunto de instrucciones, de orientaciones hacia los procuradores del Departamento de Justicia respecto de la forma de evitar el encarcelamiento de personas o aliviar la situación de personas que estaban por delitos menores o que estaban simplemente por posesión de drogas. Se ha creado también dentro de la CICAD un grupo de trabajo para enfrentar el tema del tratamiento penal y penitenciario. Es decir, todos nuestros países tienen algún papel que jugar en esta materia y nosotros hemos pensado que este ciertamente será uno de los temas que vamos a tratar en la Asamblea General del próximo 19 de septiembre. Creo que es importante señalar que en esa Asamblea seguramente existirá coincidencia en tratar este tema que de alguna manera es ya una novedad junto con otros que se están barajando en nuestra política y que apunta en la dirección que nosotros queremos celebrar, que es precisamente humanizar sustantivamente el tratamiento del tema de la droga, no concentrarnos en la guerra contra las drogas. De hecho, el concepto de guerra contra las drogas ya está usado cada vez más, por muy pocas las autoridades, incluso en este hemisferio, que usan la famosa expresión de war on drugs, es El problema de las drogas es mucho más complejo que eso. Ciertamente, creo que también tenemos consenso en la necesidad de fortalecer nuestra lucha contra el crimen organizado. Ciertamente estamos de acuerdo en la necesidad de fortalecer mucho nuestros sistemas nuestros sistemas policiales y judiciales en esta materia, pero con una orientación distinta. Debe ser siempre una orientación rehabilitadora, recuperadora, si se quiere, y en la cual este tema de las penas alternativas juega un papel muy fundamental. Yo creo que hoy día tenemos un panel muy bueno. Tenemos aquí personas que, tanto desde el punto de vista de los gobiernos, de los sistemas judiciales, como de la sociedad civil, tienen experiencia sobre este punto, sobre estos asuntos, y por lo tanto escuchar sus puntos de vista es lo que motiva la presencia de todos acá. Les doy la bienvenida, les agradezco mucho que estén con nosotros y también a todos ustedes por haber venido a escucharnos. Muchas gracias.
Muchas gracias, secretario general, por esta introducción, y pasamos directamente al panel y le pediría al embajador Simons que procediera con la moderación del mismo.
Thank you very much, thank you, Mr. Secretary General, for the very kind introduction. I think we really are fortunate to have an absolutely
first-class panel with us this afternoon. As the Secretary General mentioned, we have representatives of executive branch, judicial branch, and civil society, which I think illustrates the multi-dimensional nature of this challenge and the fact that as a result of the Secretary General's initiative in putting together a broad group of people to work on this drug report, now at the OAS, we work not only with executive branches, but also very heavily with judicial branches and increasingly with civil society, who have so much that they can bring to the table. So we're delighted with the panel, and I think we need to get directly to the issues here. So I will ask Jonathan to speak first. Jonathan Wroblewski is the Director of Office of Policy and Legislation in the Criminal Division of the U.S. Department of Justice. He's also served as a trial attorney with the Civil Rights Division, and he served on the U.S. Sentencing Commission as Deputy General Counsel and Director of Legislative and Public Affairs. He's also taught at George Washington University and George Mason University. He studied at the University of Cambridge's Institute on Criminology, also at Duke University and Stanford Law School. But perhaps most importantly, he's been working very closely with us at the CICAD. He's been a speaker at our commission meetings, and he's also been very extensively involved in our working group on alternative incarceration. So, Jonathan, thank you, welcome, and we look forward to hearing from you.
Thank you very much, Ambassador Simon. Can anybody hear me? Nobody can hear me. Is there anything I need to do?
Keep touching it until it sounds.
How about now? Better? Okay. First of all, thank you, Ambassador Simon. And no? You're shaking your head no. Now, better? Okay. I'm going to try anyway. Thank you so much, everyone, for having me, for inviting me and the Justice Department to participate in this. I'm happy to be here to discuss our work over the last several years in trying to reduce our use of incarceration in the United States. And I want to start off by talking just a little bit about why we're trying to reduce the use of incarceration. And I think that's a very, very important point to begin with, because there are many reasons why we are trying to reduce the use of incarceration. There are budgetary reasons, there are public safety reasons, and there are human rights reasons. And I think it's important that we at least acknowledge all of them as we go forward in discussing this.
Okay. Better now? Yes, much better. Okay. So thank you all for having me. And what I began with was that there are many reasons why we need to discuss the use of incarceration, and many reasons why we in the United States are trying to reduce the use of incarceration. And I think it's very important to acknowledge all of those reasons. And in the United States, the reasons include budgetary reasons, just scarce resources, public safety reasons, and also human rights reasons. And I'll be touching on all of them as we go forward. If any of you have heard me speak before, you know that I see our situation in the United States on drugs and crime through a historical lens, and I just want to touch on the history just a little bit. The use of incarceration in the United States was not always extraordinary. Right now we have more than 2.2 million people in prisons and jails across the United States, and that turns out to be about 700 persons per 100,000, which is many times the average of most developed countries. But it wasn't always the case. If you go back as late as 1960, 1970, the use of incarceration in the United States was actually the same as most developed countries. About 1972, we had about 200,000 people in prisons in the United States. And several things happened in the 1960s and 1970s that changed the historical trajectory of our use of incarceration in the United States. Let me just mention a couple of those things. We saw in the 1960s and 1970s dramatically increased use of illegal drugs in the United States. That includes dramatically increased use of cocaine, of marijuana, of opiates, and that use included a lot of substance abuse disorders, not just recreational use that was perfectly safe. At the same time, in the 1960s, 70s, and 80s, we saw in the United States a dramatically increased amount of violent crime. And it happened across the country in large cities, in small towns. And of course, there was a relationship between the drug use and the violent crime, not a direct one-to-one relationship, but there was a relationship between the two. At the same time, in the United States at that time, we were going through a civil rights movement, social turmoil. One of our presidents resigned from office at the time, and there were large social disruptions across the United States. And all of that led to dramatic changes in our criminal justice system in the United States. Our legislatures felt the need to do something about the increased use of drugs and the increased violent crime. And when I say increased violent crime, I'm talking about increases of 200%, 300%, 400% in cities across the country. It was a very violent time in the United States. And what happened is that our legislatures made a lot of policy changes. It included more police on the street, the professionalization of police, more treatment beds, an increased federal role in criminal justice. Historically, the federal government had a very modest role in public safety issues. And then also sentencing reform. And those sentencing reforms included new mandatory minimum sentencing statutes. It included things like sentencing guidelines, the elimination of parole, something called truth in sentencing. And all of that put together resulted in dramatically increased incarceration use in the United States, going from roughly 100 persons per 100,000 up to about 700 persons per 100,000. In the federal criminal justice system where I work, our federal prison system had, as late as the early 1980s, had about 25,000 prisoners. Today, there are about 220,000 prisoners. The increases were very, very large and very, very swift. Now, what happened as a result of all these reforms? Well, there's good news and there's bad news. The good news is we actually have seen reduced violent crime in the United States, dramatic reductions in violent crime over the last 20 years. Our murder rate has been cut in half across the country. Our violent crime rate has been cut in half across the country. The bad news, of course, is that we are seeing unsustainable costs. And when I say costs, I mean both fiscal costs and then human costs. The effects of 2.2 million people in prison have been dramatic on many communities across the country, and they have also been dramatic in terms of the budgets, both in the United States in the federal system as well as in states across the country. Now, all of that has led to significant reforms, and it has started at our state levels. Our criminal justice system, as you know, is decentralized, meaning that we have 50 different criminal codes. We have 17,000 different police departments. We have 50 different legislators that are thinking about criminal justice issues and are making policy. At the state level, it turns out that's where you can find our leaders for reform. And part of the reason you can find the leaders for reform at the state level is because they experienced the budgetary crisis first. If you go back to 2006, 2007, 2008, the beginning of the latest recession, state budgets were squeezed dramatically, and criminal justice, and especially state prison systems, count for a significant part of state budgets. And so we started to see reforms in states across the United States on sentencing issues and on the use of incarceration. And the results have been significant, although, frankly, modest. So we have seen a reduction, a slight reduction in our national prison population, down by about 100,000 people over the last several years. And we have also seen at the same time continued decreases in crime and increases in public safety. And what you see in most of these states that have brought about these reforms is a following of a particular model that has gone under the name of justice reinvestment. And justice reinvestment is meant to reduce the use of incarceration, which is very expensive, both, again, fiscally and on a human scale, and to save some of the money, but then to also reinvest some of the money, and reinvest that in treatment, in prevention, and in something we call in the United States prisoner reentry, which is assisting people who have been convicted but are not incarcerated in returning to a law-abiding life and addressing whatever particular problems they might have. At the federal level, you probably have heard that the Attorney General announced last year an initiative called the Smart on Crime Initiative. And the principles of the Attorney General's Smart on Crime Initiative was to build on the success of the states that have implemented these justice reinvestment approaches, and to focus on the highest and best use for crime control resources. It is a lower cost approach to crime control, lower human costs and lower fiscal costs. And the basic components of the Smart on Crime Initiative is robust policing and prosecution. It's not about turning our backs on crime as it's being committed. It's ensuring that our police are staffed properly and that they are investigating crime and bringing people who are committing crimes to account. However, it also includes mindful and careful use of imprisonment. And frankly, what that means is less use of imprisonment, ensuring that imprisonment is used for the most dangerous offenders and not used without thought. It includes effective prisoner reentry, which again is providing resources to offenders so as they return to the communities, they do not reoffend. So our goal is reducing reoffending. It includes robust treatment, intervention, and prevention programs. And we're taking many steps
to implement this type of Smart on Crime initiative. And one of the things that was mentioned earlier today was a directive that the Attorney General has made to our federal prosecutors in terms of charging people who are arrested for trafficking in drugs. Under federal law, there are mandatory penalties for anyone who is caught involved in trafficking certain quantities of drugs. And what the Attorney General directed our prosecutors is, again, to be more mindful in the selection of charges. That if there are low-level offenders who are nonviolent, who are not associated with gangs or cartels, who do not have a significant criminal history, not to charge these mandatory minimum sentencing statutes. And the reason is because they're very expensive, again, on the fiscal level and also on the human level, and it's unnecessary in terms of improving public safety. And if people are charged with these mandatory minimums and are serving very long prison sentences unnecessarily, the resources are being used for imprisonment and not for these other components that are extremely important and part of the Smart on Crime initiative. Now, what is the progress to date? It is, again, I would say at this point, fairly modest. Again, at the state level, the use of incarceration has been reduced, although at a relatively small level. At the federal level, we have seen for the first time this past year a small reduction of 3,000 or 4,000 people in the federal prison population. Now, that is a relatively small amount in a prison population of 220,000. But the trajectory for the first time in over 30 years has changed. And we believe, because of a number of steps that have happened both within the Justice Department and also within the judiciary, we think those numbers will continue to trend down over the course of the next several years. At the same time, we think it's important to look at violent crime and what has happened. And again, over the last several years, as these changes have been implemented, violent crime in the United States has been reduced. Not uniformly in every single state, but across the country as a whole, it has been reduced and continues to go down. What we see also is that some states that have implemented this type of justice reinvestment approach, reducing the use of incarceration, but taking some of that savings and investing it in other more effective ways of improving public safety, those states have seen both the largest decreases in the use of incarceration as well as the biggest decreases in violent crime. Other states where the reductions of imprisonment have been a little more haphazard, and you may have read about what happened in California, where federal courts ordered the state to reduce incarceration by a significant amount, but without this type of justice reinvestment approach, violent crime had ticked up a little bit. So we think so far what we've learned is that if you follow a thoughtful approach, reinvest some of the savings from the reductions in the use of incarceration into other public safety investments, that you can achieve increased public safety, you can achieve greater human rights, and you can achieve greater justice, all at a lower cost. That's what we've seen, and that's the approach that we're following. And I look forward to hearing from everyone else and also to answering any questions over the course of the rest of the roundtable.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Jonathan. Our next speaker is Justice Stephanie Jackson Hazley. Justice Hazley has been resident magistrate at the Magistrates Court in Jamaica since October of 2007. Previously, she was a prosecutor at the Office of Public Prosecutions, where she was deputy director. She was also the first prosecutor assigned to the Drug Treatment Court program in Jamaica, and currently she's the presiding judge of the Kingston Drug Treatment Court and has been engaged in promoting the concept of drug treatment courts across the Caribbean. She's worked very closely with the CICAD over the last couple of years, has worked to bring this concept to other countries, including Barbados and Trinidad, and currently she is serving as a fellow working at the Executive Secretariat of the CICAD. So, Justice Hazley, thank you so much for being with us, and we look forward to hearing your words, which will focus on the gender perspective of alternatives to incarceration.
Thank you, Ambassador. And thank you. Let me also thank the organizers of this roundtable for including me in this forum. I feel quite honored to be a part of this roundtable, and I'm even more pleased to be focusing on a topic that I feel very passionate about, the topic of alternatives to incarceration. As judges, we're constantly called upon to make really tough decisions regarding sentencing. And I say judges, but that includes, I'm sure, policymakers, legislators as well. We're all called upon to make decisions as it relates to alternatives to incarceration. And finding the right balance is something that we all strive to achieve. And how do we go about doing this? As it relates to drug-related crimes, theoretically there are many options available to a judge, but practically speaking, there are constraints involved in imposing non-custodial sentences in some instances. Forgive me for focusing a little on the English-speaking Caribbean, and I'll also be making reference to Jamaica from time to time, as this is where my area of expertise lies. Judges in the Caribbean do have many options in relation to sentencing as it relates to drug offenses. In Jamaica, drug offenses are predominantly tried in the resident magistrate's court, and in those courts, the offenses attract sentences which are much lesser than if they were tried in the Supreme Court. But the custom is that they are tried in the resident magistrate's court. The maximum penalty for any one drug offense is that of 5 years imprisonment in the case of cocaine and 3 years in the case of ganja and other offenses and other drugs. Over the years, there have been many decisions going as far as to the highest court for some Caribbean countries, to the Judicial Committee of the Privy Council, stipulating the need for incarcerated sentences for offenses involved in the trafficking of drugs. And so a lot of judges feel constrained to follow the ruling in these decisions as it relates to the types of sentences that are to be imposed. However, the trend has been, recently I would say, that judges are becoming more aware of the kind of discretion that they have and more aware of the other factors that are operating, and so they tend to exercise a little more discretion in terms of sentencing. Thankfully, in Jamaica and in most of the Caribbean countries, I believe there are no mandatory minimum sentences as it relates to judges. So there's a wide discretion within the ambit of the legislation that's involved. And there are, in fact, many statutes that provide for alternatives to incarceration. In Barbados, under the Penal Systems Reform Act, in Dominica, under the Criminal Justice Reform Act, and in Jamaica, also under the Criminal Justice Reform Act. It provides specifically for alternatives for incarceration. It provides for punishment in lieu of incarceration in certain circumstances, and that allows and gives judges the discretion to deal with offenders in other ways apart from imprisonment. The types of sentencing options involved include suspended sentences with or without supervision, community service orders, attendance orders, curfew orders, and of course fines and probation orders. And this provides rehabilitation outside of the walls of the prison. It provides an opportunity for an individual to be able to be rehabilitated and reduce the rate of recidivism of offenders. The provisions in these statutes are sometimes applied in drug-related cases, and so they do in fact provide alternatives to incarceration for those individuals. But despite that, we find that usually in cases involving drug trafficking, the sentences are custodial. And so despite all of the provisions that provide for non-incarcerated sentences, the incarceration rate among Caribbean countries is relatively high. And that is certainly a matter of concern. A significant number of persons are also incarcerated even before trial without bail. And so the policies and public interest concerns encourage incarceration of people who are associated with the drug trade, and that is done in cases without enough consideration for the scale or the level of drug trafficking that's involved, or where this individual in particular falls in the whole drug trade. And I think that there's obviously a need for greater awareness in this regard. As it relates to the posture regarding providing non-custodial sentences to persons who are arrested for offenses involving the use of small quantities, the level of awareness is certainly rising and has been building, and judges usually refrain from imposing custodial sentences in relation to those offenses. Jamaica's position is somewhat unique in that it has legislation which establishes a drug treatment court. The legislation is called the Drug Court Treatment and Rehabilitation of Offenders Act, and this provides directly an alternative to incarceration for a drug-dependent offender. The good thing about this legislation is that it's not restricted to only the individual who is charged with possession of a drug offense, but it is wider and it expands to persons who are charged with other offenses who are deemed to have committed these offenses whilst under the influence of drugs. In Trinidad and Tobago, recently, a document titled A Policy to Establish Drug Treatment Courts was created, and that too provides a viable alternative to incarceration, because drug courts operate to divert non-violent offenders in Trinidad and Tobago who have substance abuse problems from incarceration, to divert them into a supervised program with treatment and rigorous standards of supervision and monitoring. Treatment programs are developed as an alternative to imprisonment, thereby easing the overcrowding in the prisons. Offenders who commit drug-related crimes because of their addiction or because of circumstances born out of their addiction can be dealt with effectively with these programs. Alternatives to incarceration are very important in many instances as they serve to protect society, mitigate harm to families of offenders, whilst reducing the high cost of incarceration to taxpayers. And I'm going to segue into the most important part of my presentation, and that relates to gender under alternatives to incarceration. It is very important at this stage to distinguish between the types of offenses that are suitable for alternatives to incarceration. And that includes, obviously, drug offenses for which use is predominant, offenses which are non-violent, property offenses, those committed whilst under the influence of drugs are really suitable. And I started out by doing that because these are some of the offenses, or it's really these kinds of offenses that women are most often charged with, and that women are most often before the court in relation to. Statistics from the Department of Correctional Services in Jamaica revealed that the most common crimes committed by adult females over the years are drug-related, followed by forgery and embezzlement. In Trinidad and Tobago, a study carried out also revealed that drug-related offenses were the most prevalent offense for which women are incarcerated, and that is followed by violent offenses and property offenses. This trend is common throughout the region. Women are therefore suitable for consideration for alternatives to incarceration because of the types of offenses that they are found to commit. It is important to also consider the effects of alternatives to incarceration where women are concerned. And it has been found that the effects are somewhat disproportionate to the effects on their male counterparts. The effects are not usually limited to personal repercussions as it spreads to their family members and their children. And so I think it is important at this stage for us to consider how can we address the situation to provide for more gender awareness in dealing with alternatives to incarceration. The law as it exists, and I mentioned some of this before, makes no distinction between males and females as it relates to alternatives. Judges, legislators, and policymakers are suitably placed, I think, to influence the laws dealing with sentences. In none of the legislation or policy documents is there any distinction between how males and females are to be treated. And this is perhaps a function of our constitutions, which provide for non-discriminatory laws. So the question is, how do we create laws that are gender conscious and at the same time laws that do not offend the Constitution? And I think one of the solutions to this is for greater awareness, for greater discretion in judges and magistrates who impose these sentences. In order to fully understand the role that gender plays, we must look also at the dispensers of justice. Who are they? How are they different from the dispensers of justice in other cases? We must look to whether or not there are any provisions in law that demonstrate any consideration for gender. And I have to say that there is. I think the Jamaican legislation, the Jamaican Drug Court Treatment and Rehabilitation of Offenders Act makes a distinction, and it specifically stipulates that the court should be comprised of one resident magistrate and 2 justices of the peace, one of whom must be a female. And I think this is a very important factor, and this is no doubt because it is felt that it is important to have, females involved in this process, and perhaps to consider what effect will that have in dealing with offenders, whether male or females. It is important to also consider what methods can be utilized to raise the level of awareness of judges and other players in dealing with gender issues. Judges are sworn to uphold the law and to demonstrate fairness and non-discrimination. So how do they find the right balance to deal with issues amidst the need to uphold the rule of law? Women and men invariably have different needs, and so sentencing must be tailored towards the needs of the individual. And hence the importance of obtaining a social inquiry report. And this is a report that basically tells you everything about the person. Clearly, it will indicate at the very outset whether it's a male or female, what are the circumstances impacting on this person's life, what are the factors that a judge ought to consider in sentencing this individual. There have been many cases in Jamaica and elsewhere that have considered the whole issue of sentencing. And in fact, there's one case in particular that I'd like to make mention of. It's the case of the Queen against Patricia Henry. And it's a case in which the accused, who was female, was sentenced to 2.5 years imprisonment for offenses involving possession of ganja, possession, dealing in, and also taking steps preparatory to exporting. And the sentence imposed was 2.5 years. The Court of Appeal had this to consider, and the decision regarding sentence was actually overturned. And the specific reason that was given was because of the lack of a social inquiry report to guide the magistrate during the sentencing process. And I just thought I'd underscore that and highlight that it is very important, and judges are becoming even more aware of the fact that before you can proceed to sentence an individual, you have to have all of the relevant information, whether male or female, the role that this person plays in the family, the role they play in the community. All of that is important. If it's a female, what kind of issues are involved? Are there young children involved? Is there a pregnancy issue there? Women's health issues? All of that. Judges must consider the gender-specific needs of all offenders. Judges make the law, specifically the common law, and so they are suitably placed to create more laws to specifically address the needs of both genders. And so this involves a recognition that sometimes the women who commit drug-related crimes do so under duress, under the influence of a male counterpart, and a lot of them are in very vulnerable positions, and in most instances are somewhat committing offenses which are regarded as low-scale drug trafficking or low-scale offenses in the whole gamut of drug-related offenses. And that is why it is felt that women are really suitably placed to benefit from alternatives to incarceration. The Drug Treatment Court, its operation in Jamaica and elsewhere, you find is predominantly comprised of men. In fact, women make up less than 5% of the participants in this court. So one wonders, is it that the program should be more tailored towards the specific needs of women? Should it be geared towards a gender as opposed to just one program for all participants? What kind of stigma is attached when they participate in this program? Is it affecting their participation, and how many persons will become a part of this program and be able to access this specific alternative to incarceration? It is interesting to note that most of the treatment programs make no theoretical distinction between how males and females are to be treated, and this should not be the case. Treatment programs should be tailored to fit the gender of the individual involved. And this brings me to one point in particular, because I think it may be very important to impose sentencing guidelines as it relates to gender. And a lot of countries have sentencing guidelines. I know that Trinidad has, the United States have sentencing guidelines, but there are other countries that do not have. And I think in creating sentencing guidelines, there should be some consideration towards gender and towards how to deal with these issues. Another challenge to imposing alternatives to incarceration is that of public interest concerns. And I think one solution to that is to increase public awareness of the public, because many persons are of the view that persons who are involved in drug trafficking should be given custodial sentences. More awareness of the impact of this should be promoted so that the public interest concerns are not as serious that would impact on the judge's sentencing ability. I make reference briefly to the Declaration of Antigua, Guatemala, and that encourages member states in the framework of international cooperation to analyze and to base their policies on scientific knowledge and research. It also encouraged member states, in accordance with their domestic law, to continue strengthening measures and policies, including a gender perspective as appropriate, to reduce overcrowding in prisons. And I think it is important to highlight that as member states, we really ought to look at what strategies we can put in place to improve in gender awareness. Some of the solutions may involve more capacity building programs for not only judges, but legislators, policymakers, prosecutors, attorneys at law, police officers, so that they are more aware of how to define gender equality issues and how to recognize their role in the process, how to find the appropriate balance between overall fairness in keeping with the constitutional provisions of equal access to justice. How to do this without being discriminatory. I think that judges, as the gatekeepers of the law and the designers of the law, have a duty to uphold the law, and law which is consistent with constitutional standards, but also bearing in mind that judicial discretion does enable a judge to consider how does gender impact on my decision. The principles of restorative justice, the principles of therapeutic jurisprudence are also areas that judges should be educated in. And I'm really thankful, I'll say, for the program that has been operating at CICAD, at the level of CICAD, of the Drug Court Program for the Americas, because remarkable work has been done in that regard in improving the capacity building of the players who work not only in the drug courts, but who work in the justice system. And I think more of this will help to enhance gender awareness and to promote greater justice for both genders. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Judge Hazley. I think we've had two very interesting presentations with a focus on this issue of discretion on the part of judges and prosecutors, but from a different perspective, a U.S. perspective and a Caribbean perspective. And I think they've dovetailed very nicely. Our next speaker is Graciela Toussaint, who is president of Intercambios, civil society organization based in Argentina. She's a social worker, a specialist in social science and health. She also works as a professor and researcher at the University of Buenos Aires. She's a consultant of the Drug Addiction Research Group of the International Federation of Catholic Universities. She's a founding member of the NGO's network working on treatment and prevention of HIV/AIDS in Argentina. She's also a former member of the Fondo de Ayuda Toxicológica and has worked very closely also with us in the CICAD for a long time, a long-standing advisor, and we're delighted. And of course, last week she was very actively involved in the Intercambios outreach event in San Jose, Costa Rica, in preparation for the OAS General Assembly in Guatemala. So, Graciela, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you very much, Ambassador Paul Simons. It's okay. Muy buenas tardes a todas, a todos. En primer lugar, permítanme expresar mi agradecimiento por la invitación, la posibilidad de estar participando en esta mesa redonda a pocos días de la celebración de la Asamblea Extraordinaria en Guatemala, en el marco que sabemos en estos días se continúa discutiendo el proyecto de resolución que será aprobado durante la Asamblea y sin lugar a dudas este tema es uno de los que está presente en estos debates y es un tema que para la sociedad civil de toda la región es de gran importancia y tenemos amplias expectativas de un avance en la dirección que permita mejorar una situación realmente dramática que estamos viviendo prácticamente en todos los países de la región en términos del hacinamiento, de las condiciones de nuestras cárceles, en buena medida debido a la aplicación de determinadas líneas de políticas en materia de drogas. Por supuesto, el tema es mucho más amplio y complejo, pero trayendo de alguna manera las preocupaciones centrales que se pusieron de relevancia la semana pasada durante la conferencia a la que hacía mención el embajador Simons. Yo quisiera centrarme en dos aspectos o en dos actores particularmente castigados en la región y sobre los cuales una reflexión sobre alternativas al encarcelamiento consideramos que es crucial, que es el caso de las personas consumidoras de drogas y que es el caso de aquellos eslabones más débiles en la cadena, como los pequeños vendedores, como los pequeños transportistas, y en manera muy particular, tal como señalaba la distinguida colega del panel, el caso de las mujeres. En relación con las personas consumidoras de drogas, hay sin lugar a dudas un consenso creciente respecto de el hecho de que el consumidor de drogas no debe ser considerado un delincuente. Tenemos muy presente y celebramos las palabras del secretario general cuando presentó el año pasado el informe mundial sobre el problema de las drogas, el informe sobre el problema mundial de las drogas en las Américas, cuando señaló esta situación. Y por supuesto acordamos absolutamente con este hecho. Ahora, si acordamos con que el consumidor de sustancias ilícitas no debe ser considerado un delincuente, pensamos que debemos realmente avanzar en concretar el hecho de que el consumo y las conductas asociadas al consumo de drogas no deben ser consideradas delito. Es decir, que no deberíamos, en esta situación en particular, estar pensando o estar discutiendo alternativas al encarcelamiento, sino que deberíamos definitivamente decir que el encarcelamiento para estas conductas no tiene sentido porque no estamos ante la presencia de hechos que deben ser considerados delito y que por lo tanto deben tener una pena y menos aún una pena privativa de la libertad. Ahora bien, ¿cuál es la situación que tenemos respecto de esta situación? Una publicación muy interesante y reciente del colectivo de estudios Drogas y Derecho, un grupo de expertos de varios países de la región, revela que en muchos de nuestros países los usuarios de drogas ilícitas son perseguidos penalmente, a pesar de que en muchos de nuestros países el consumo de drogas no es un delito. Por ejemplo, en Argentina, en Ecuador, en México, en Bolivia, el acto de consumir drogas no está considerado un delito. Sin embargo, por ejemplo, para el caso de Argentina, este estudio remite a una muestra del año 2011 en la cual alrededor de entre el 73 y el 74% de las causas abiertas por infracción a la ley de drogas, causas iniciadas por las fuerzas de seguridad en la ciudad de Buenos Aires, eran causas abiertas por el delito de tenencia de estupefacientes para consumo personal. Una situación similar de alguna manera la encontramos en Ecuador, donde este estudio refiere que en la actualidad se encuentran detenidas con sentencia condenatoria 5.103 personas por el delito de tenencia o posesión de sustancias estupefacientes, 5.103 personas de un total de 6.467 detenciones en relación con los delitos de drogas. En el caso de México, entre el 2009 y mayo del 2013, a nivel nacional fueron detenidas 140.860 personas por consumo de drogas y fueron iniciadas por la misma causa y en ese mismo periodo 53.769 averiguaciones en el sistema federal. Y en Bolivia, otro de los países que no tiene penalizado el consumo, entre el año 2005 y el 2011 se detuvieron 6.316 personas por posesión de drogas, en su mayoría cannabis, a pesar de que la posesión, en este caso, no está tipificada como delito. Tomando estos datos como algunos ejemplos en nuestros países, volvemos entonces a insistir en el hecho de que si acordamos que el consumidor de drogas no debe ser considerado un delincuente, si acordamos y la necesidad de distinguir entre los diversos tipos de usos de drogas con mayor o menor carácter problemático en esta situación, si acordamos en la necesidad de distinguir entonces entre tipos de usuarios de drogas, tipos de drogas consumidas y sus distintos efectos, creo que deberíamos poder acordar en que el derecho penal nunca debería ser empleado en casos de consumo y de posesión simple, y menos utilizar al derecho penal como una excusa para proteger la salud. Esto creo que entonces nos lleva a pensar que debe hacerse efectiva, ya sea cambiando la letra de la ley, cuando las legislaciones así lo plantean, o corrigiendo la práctica de las agencias encargadas de la aplicación de la ley, porque a veces modificamos las legislaciones. El caso de Argentina es muy claro en ese sentido. Llevamos ya 5 años de una resolución de la Corte Suprema de Justicia de la Nación que ha declarado inconstitucional en el año 2009 la penalización de la tenencia de drogas para consumo personal. A pesar de esa clara intervención de nuestra Corte Suprema de Justicia, continuamos viendo fuerzas policiales que detienen a personas por la posesión de una pequeña cantidad de una sustancia ilícita para el propio consumo. Continuamos viendo determinadas jurisdicciones del sistema judicial que continúan abriendo causas judiciales a estos consumidores. Entonces, a veces no solamente alcanza con una modificación en términos de la letra de la ley, sino que claramente es necesario corregir estas prácticas. Y corregirlas, decía, en términos de hacer efectiva la descriminalización del porte o de la tenencia para el consumo personal de drogas, así como la descriminalización del cultivo doméstico para consumo personal. Entendemos que el uso de drogas es un acto privado y que tener drogas para el propio consumo, discúlpenme la insistencia, no debería ser considerado un delito. Y en este mismo sentido, la aplicación de medidas de seguridad en el marco de la legislación penal, como, una vez más, permítanme traer el ejemplo de mi país, nuestra actual ley de estupefacientes, que data del año 1989, presenta las figuras de medidas de seguridad educativas, curativas, alternativas a la pena privativa de la libertad. Ahora, estas medidas de seguridad educativas y curativas en el marco de una legislación penal aplicadas por la justicia penal, nos parece que terminan convirtiendo a derechos como la educación, derechos como la salud, en lugar de derechos en castigos ejercidos por la justicia penal. Nuevamente, entonces, las personas que usan drogas no deben ser objeto de sanciones por ello y en esta misma dirección entendemos que el cultivo para el propio consumo tampoco debe ser considerado un delito. La ley penal no puede confundir a quienes cultivan plantas para su uso personal con los diferentes eslabones de la producción y o tráfico de drogas. El otro actor al cual decía que quería hacer referencia son los sujetos menores en la cadena delictiva o los usuarios acusados de la pequeña venta, que en realidad son la inmensa mayoría de las personas encarceladas en nuestros sistemas penitenciarios. En el caso de las mujeres que se mencionaba, entre el año 2006 y el 2011 se duplicó el número de mujeres encarceladas en la región, que pasaron de 40.000 a 74.000. Y los delitos de drogas son la primera o la segunda causa del encarcelamiento de las mujeres. También un estudio reciente de principios de este año, un excelente estudio de la Comisión Interamericana de Mujeres, menciona y describe ampliamente esta situación. Es un informe, creo, que constituye un insumo clave para generar una reflexión profunda en torno a este tema. Sin lugar a dudas, lo que observamos en estas situaciones es una desproporcionada respuesta penal, y esto nos conduce a pensar en la necesidad de atenuar la escala penal para estos pequeños actores de la cadena del tráfico. No podemos dejar de tener presente el hecho de que los eslabones más bajos suelen ser personas muy pobres y que el castigo que reciben muchas veces es un castigo similar o que los considera como si fueran parte de la estructura y de la responsabilidad del crimen organizado. Creemos que la evaluación para definir la pena debe basarse en una pregunta, que es ¿cuál es la función de esa persona en la estructura del crimen organizado? ¿Es lo mismo un joven pobre, desocupado, que hace delivery, que entrega sustancias en casas de clase media, desde un barrio humilde, que un funcionario público cómplice del tráfico en gran escala? Son dos situaciones que merecen una pena similar. Estamos convencidos de que no, y que por lo tanto es necesario atenuar la escala penal para estos pequeños actores del tráfico en situaciones de vulnerabilidad y fijar una proporcionalidad de las penas según el nivel del compromiso en el negocio. El embajador Simons hacía mención a el evento de que participamos la semana pasada en San José, en Costa Rica, la 5ª Conferencia Latinoamericana y primera Centroamericana sobre políticas de drogas, como parte de una serie de eventos satélites a la conferencia. Tuvimos el día 2 de septiembre un foro de la sociedad civil que reunió a un buen número de representantes de organizaciones de la sociedad civil de una multiplicidad de países de la región, y los reunió con el objetivo de elaborar una serie de recomendaciones, de aportes para los gobiernos con vistas a la próxima asamblea, así como el año pasado, previo a la asamblea de Antigua, se celebró un foro de la sociedad civil que con el aporte de más de 500 organizaciones de toda la región llevó a la mesa de discusión una serie de aportes. También aquí quisimos reiterar esta situación y llevar el compromiso y la visión de la sociedad civil en este debate hemisférico. Permítanme, es un documento que ya ha sido puesto en conocimiento de la OEA, y que además nos hemos comprometido todos los distintos representantes de distintas organizaciones de la sociedad civil de hacerlo llegar a nuestras respectivas cancillerías. Pero permítanme, en relación con este punto, compartir con ustedes algunos de los párrafos que hacen referencia al tema que nos ocupa hoy en esta mesa redonda. Acordamos desde la sociedad civil mencionar que los estados deben respetar el derecho de toda persona que usa drogas a elegir el momento y el tipo de dispositivo de atención. No deben ser obligadas a iniciar, suspender o aceptar un determinado tratamiento. El consentimiento informado debe comunicar claramente las alternativas y condiciones de los tratamientos. La atención debe basarse en el principio bioético de autonomía de las personas. Quizás este párrafo ustedes dirán que tiene que ver con lo que estamos aquí discutiendo. Yo creo que tiene mucho que ver, porque cuando estamos observando que algún énfasis puesto en las alternativas al encarcelamiento está orientado a, digamos, la opción tratamiento versus encarcelamiento, nos parece que en esos casos el consentimiento informado de la persona y por lo tanto el principio bioético de autonomía queda un poco vulnerado, y nos preocupa que esto sea así. Continúo con otro párrafo. Creemos, por otro lado, que es necesario separar del campo penal y de la seguridad el uso y consumo personal de las drogas, así como todas las conductas tendientes a esa finalidad. Es imprescindible establecer criterios objetivos que caractericen el destino de la droga para uso y consumo, de manera que las agencias de seguridad no involucren a los usuarios en el sistema criminal. Las personas que usan drogas no deben ser penalizadas y criminalizadas por su consumo. Solo una clara separación entre usuarios de drogas y mercado ilegal permitirá que el esfuerzo de las agencias de seguridad se enfoque en quienes realmente deben hacerlo. Esta medida redundará además en un primer descongestionamiento de las cárceles y de los sistemas de justicia. Es necesario velar porque a los consumidores de drogas nunca se les prive de su derecho al acceso a la salud, participación democrática, acceso a la educación, vivienda y otras garantías básicas, aun cuando existan antecedentes penales de por medio. En función de estas consideraciones, en estos aportes de la sociedad civil, se sugiere que en la resolución que se está negociando en estos momentos se incorpore un párrafo en el que se haga referencia a la violencia generada a partir del actual enfoque de las políticas de drogas por la desproporción de las penas por delitos de drogas, el hacinamiento en las cárceles y la criminalización de las mujeres que transportan drogas entre las fronteras. En este sentido, creemos conveniente que la resolución inste a adoptar medidas innovadoras respecto de la actuación de los sistemas penales, que tengan por fin la reducción del hacinamiento carcelario y de las detenciones de usuarios por posesión de drogas, asegurando la proporcionalidad de las penas, distinguiendo entre narcotráfico y otros delitos y otros tipos de delito, y estableciendo y ampliando las alternativas al encarcelamiento y la revisión de ejecución de penas para delitos relacionados con las drogas. Todo ello excluyendo el curso de cortes de drogas, dado que consideramos que las mismas siguen y perpetúan la misma lógica represiva y siguen teniendo al sistema penal como regulador de problemáticas sociosanitarias que deben ser gestionadas por otras áreas pertinentes del Estado. Yo quiero dejar aquí para que nos quede espacio para el diálogo con ustedes, pero quiero terminar señalando la expectativa, la gran expectativa y la gran esperanza que la sociedad civil de la región tiene en este proceso iniciado hace ya poco más de 2 años en la cumbre de Cartagena, todo lo que significó la elaboración del informe y la amplia participación social que esto conllevó. Y esto que se está gestando a pocas semanas de la próxima asamblea y fundamentalmente con la perspectiva en la cual creo que todos tenemos la vista puesta de manera muy precisa, que es la celebración de la sesión especial de la Asamblea General de Naciones Unidas sobre drogas para el año 2016, donde confiamos que nuestra región pueda tener realmente un lugar de liderazgo. Creemos que estamos en el momento de tenerlo y de poder avanzar hacia modificaciones fundamentales en relación con este tema. Muchas gracias.
Thank you very much, Graciela. I was struck in your presentation by the convergence of approach in many ways between your words and what we heard from the previous two speakers. In particular, this notion of discretionality and the need to focus on those people at the lower end of the spectrum. And to give them special types of treatment in terms of alternatives to incarceration, and also the focus that you had on some of the political and bureaucratic obstacles to undertaking policies that have been agreed to at the most senior level. I think the example from Argentina is very important. So thank you very much. Our final speaker is John Walsh. John needs no introduction. He is very well known in Washington in drug circles. He is a senior associate for drug policy and the Andes at WOLA, Washington Office on Latin America, since 2003. His work has contributed on the need to reassess goals and strategies of U.S. drug policy. He's also done broader work on political issues in the Andean region. And like several of our other speakers, he has worked closely with CICAD and the OAS over the past several years, including as a very important member of our scenarios group in the report on the drug problem. So, John, we look very much forward to listening to your wisdom. Thank you.
You're setting a high bar. I don't know if people hear me. Yeah? How about now? No? All right, I'll just keep talking till it works.
Okay, that will work. Thank you, Ambassador Simons, and for the microphone. Going last can either be a daunting challenge or a luxury, and I'll do the half glass full approach and treat it as a luxury. And I'm tempted to just say, yes, what you said, Graciela, and go to the, open the conversation. But I think now I have the opportunity to reflect a little and challenge us to think about the topic of the day and maybe think and hopefully broaden the debate and take advantage of the moment, the opportunities we have to do a rethink on our drug policies that have been seemingly set in stone, unalterable for so long. And I think the first reflection I challenge us to take to heart is what the immense power that incarceration represents for a state to wield, to lock somebody up, to deprive them of their liberty, either conditionally or totally. And clearly it has public purpose. There's retribution, there's deterrence, there's public safety, and we have to question to what extent those public purposes fit the question of drug offenses. And in many of the ways that all of our panelists have discussed, it's a misfit in many, many ways. And I think that's especially important to realize that in a civilized mind, incarceration should be a last resort, and it has become in too many of our countries almost a first impulse in the case of many crimes, but including drug crimes that may not be appropriate for incarceration at all, much less first impulse. So I think challenging us to understand what it is that the current situation of incarceration means for us, not just in terms of public policy, but where we are as societies, not least because, as in many other public policies that are repression-oriented, it's unevenly applied, and we all know this. So that the people who perhaps are most culpable, but also have the most power to elude prosecution and incarceration, are not the ones behind bars, by definition. It's the people who are most vulnerable, are most susceptible to arrest and prosecution, who are. So on two levels, it's one, unfair, and two, bound to be ineffective if the ultimate goal is organized crime and large drug trafficking networks. So I think the whole idea of alternatives to incarceration, I think, challenges us to understand that there may be a role for incarceration, and there certainly is in our societies, in particular securing public safety. To where is the fit with drug policy, and at what point did drug policy and its goals become conflated with a war on drugs, organized crime, and drug trafficking in a way that makes it difficult now, and we're struggling to distinguish between what it is that we want to promote in terms of public safety and public health on drug policy and what is a truly effective way to combat organized crime and illegality. And that brings to a next reflection, which is many of us in the drug policy reform community have chafed at the idea that there is one-size-fits-all solution for all things called the drug problem in every country, everywhere, and that the drug treaties handed down some half a century ago have answered all modern questions and need no further refinement or questioning. I think it should also be the case that when we think of alternatives to, in this case, incarceration, but more broadly in terms of drug policy, we're not looking for the single model that works for everyone, everywhere at the same time. Do there need to be standards, floors below which nothing is permissible in terms of basic human rights guarantees? Obviously. But I think especially at this time of sort of ripeness for innovation, the idea should be not to look for one model that applies to all countries, all people, all times, but to permit and in fact to encourage an innovation of different approaches, understanding that different countries have different opportunities, different contexts, different limitations, and not seeking to impose or unless reams of evidence are in that this will be really the best way for this country in this context to say there's one model that will work best for everybody. So, and in the same context, even one country and one jurisdiction shouldn't look to put all of its eggs in one basket. Just in terms of the talks we've heard already today, there are numerous approaches even that fit under the broad scheme of what we would call decriminalization, including decriminalizing cultivation for personal possession, ensuring that thresholds are based on the real market, not a figment of what the market might be, so that the enforcement does not just corral users into jail as purported dealers, and ensuring that, as Graciela was explaining, it's not just formally in the law, but it's in practice decriminalization exists. Proportionality in sentences, ensuring that the people who are most responsible are the ones where the sanctions fall heavily, not the least responsible, which is typically what happens now, and ensuring that the people who are most vulnerable and that their vulnerability explains much of their involvement in whatever links in the drug trade they're involved in, that's taken into account as well. Finally, if the idea is to avoid criminalizing overall, not just the incarceration, but the stigma of arrest, the liability that arrest, not merely the incarceration, lands someone with, you have to think more broadly about where does the alternative to incarceration begin. It's not simply a matter of revising sentencing downwards. It's a matter of who gets caught up in this in the first place. So it's diversion at arrest, or beyond decriminalization, thinking outside the box. If a legal regulated market is an option for a country, that is not that this is its only merit or possibility. That would in itself be an alternative to incarceration as a public policy response to substance use, which is, like it or not, a reality. So that brings me to my next reflection, which is the whole question of how we measure success, which again ties very closely to the sort of institutional inertia that builds up with public policies that we've been pursuing for a long time, they create their own metrics that reinforce their own programs and that may have nothing to do with what counts as real-life success, particularly for the people who are most affected. So if, for instance, success has been counted as, from the enforcement perspective, in terms of this is a proof of vigorous effort and therefore we're doing the right thing, more arrests, more prosecutions, more incarceration, when it may be the case that not only is that incidental to or beside the point of the questions of drug use, health problems, and crime, it may be exacerbating not just the immediate problems of the people caught up in the criminal justice system, but making their problems worse in other ways. And in particular, social costs that we may not even be immediately aware of that are involved in uneven and unfair implementation of the justice system, both in terms of racial disparities, socioeconomic disparities, but also this a sort of intangible, but I think real cost of erosion in public trust of what the justice system is about. Is it basically rigged? And are the laws that it's implementing, are they fair and do they need to be revised? So I think this whole, for me, this whole theme opens that question of if we want a new public policy and we want it to be people-centered, we want it to be oriented toward public health, we're going to need to come up with a new set of metrics to measure success that are not only avoid a trivial measure, but actually measure what we want to achieve, which is human health, well-being, and social satisfaction. And those are not process indicators of we're arresting more people. It's the well-being of the communities whose public safety law enforcement is supposed to be interested in, and their health. I think that's a huge challenge for us in this field to come up with those, not just that sound good in theory, but in practice are doable and will show us real progress, and more importantly, where the real deficits are, in particular in the health systems both in the United States, Canada, and much of Latin America, to ensure that where people do need support, harm reduction and treatment services, they're available, and it's not merely a referral to nothing. And then finally, I think we, especially as drug reform advocates who have been often, I think, rightly critical of defenders of a system unwilling to, not all, but many, unwilling to acknowledge the unintended, but by now predictable consequences of a certain drug control paradigm. We who propose that another should be given a chance, at the very least, we also need to be very transparent about it's one thing to have good intentions and to have good reasons to believe that you can create a better system, but you also need to be transparent and not just welcome, but insist on and support rigorous evaluation so that we can actually learn from the innovations that are now underway and those that may be coming in these next few years. And not so that we don't repeat the mistake of circling the wagons around something even if privately we believe that it's flawed. And I think the point we, the hemisphere, and we, probably leaders of most of the governments in our hemisphere, believe privately that there's something deeply broken and flawed with our current set of drug policies. More and more public officials are not just saying it, but challenging their own populaces to join this debate. So I really welcome being part of this panel and this theme, which I think is, as I think I've expressed, really cuts to the core of many of the challenges that we're trying to talk about.
Thank you very much, John. I think that was an excellent summary. And I think we've really had four terrific presentations, a lot of similarities. Clearly there's a need to focus on a humanization of the drug problem, a need to look outside of the criminal justice system. I thought I would take my liberty as coordinator here to ask one question for all four of you,
and then we'll open it up to the audience. And that question I have is the following. Jonathan pointed out that there are historical cycles at work here. And clearly we have bent the curve in the United States on crime rates. Crime rates are on their way down. So perhaps a more humanistic approach, an approach less focused on the criminal justice system, may be easier politically to contemplate in an environment in which we have declining crime rates. So my question is, for Judge Hazley, for Graciela, and for John, perhaps John, you could speak to Central America. In those areas of the Americas where crime rates are not going down, where they're going up or where they're staying the same, what types of political obstacles exist for an approach that focuses on alternatives? And how can we, working together, overcome those obstacles? Judge Hazley, would you like to take that one on?
It is a difficult question. Political obstacles that exist. You know, from my personal experience, there are always obstacles in terms of enhancing political will, because, you know, the political, or I would say political persons, they usually have somewhat of a different focus from that of the judiciary, from that of policymakers. And so it is always difficult trying to enhance and trying to ensure that they recognize what is integral, especially as it relates to justice. You know, what is integral to judges being able to do their task well? How do we go about doing that? And so I think it is so important for the political will as well to engage in more forums of this nature where they can get information in terms of the approach to certain things in the courts, outside of the courts, in society. We have had challenges in terms of even trying to expand the alternative to incarceration that we have through the drug treatment court. We've had challenges from that respect trying to create more drug courts, because the focus now in Jamaica and elsewhere is really on economics and the economic constraints. And so that's always a concern. How do you do this amidst all of the other competing interests? And so I think it's really trying to emphasize the need, the necessity for the kind of approaches that focus on alternatives to incarceration, focus on issues that will try to improve the accessibility of more persons throughout the countries to alternatives to incarceration. And, you know, it's always an issue of how do you do this? But I'm thinking that in order to do this, you really have to enhance the capacities of the political persons as well.
Thank you. Graciela, ¿quieres tratar de abordar?
Sí, pensaba a partir de esta pregunta en el estado del debate en la región. Estamos, creo que en un punto, como me arriesgaría a decir, nunca antes. Y esto nos da una oportunidad única de incrementar la voluntad política, presente en muchos de los gobiernos de la región, quizás un poco más renuente en algunos otros, en términos de cómo avanzar en transformaciones profundas en relación con las políticas de drogas. Creo que hay un desafío muy fuerte, muy presente en muchas de nuestras sociedades, que tiene que ver también con el hecho de que no siempre la opinión pública acompaña esta voluntad de transformación. Quizás continuamos presentando, y creo que aquí debemos asumir la responsabilidad de distintos actores, en tanto se continúa muchas veces presentando a la respuesta penal, a la respuesta del castigo, como la respuesta que daría solución a un problema que en definitiva es de carácter netamente social, que remite a situaciones de exclusión social y ante los cuales la respuesta penal, por supuesto que no es la solución. En ese sentido, quizás a veces los propios actores del sistema judicial son quienes tienen muy en claro esto. En muchos países de la región hay un fuerte movimiento desde los propios actores del sistema penal en términos de reconocer que la respuesta debe pasar por otro lado, que la respuesta es una respuesta en términos de política social, en términos de orientaciones que reduzcan la profunda desigualdad que, por ejemplo, continúa imperando en la región de América Latina. Y quizás creo que también hay un desafío que está presente en los nuevos actores sociales que asumen un rol en esta discusión política. En Costa Rica la semana pasada, entre los diversos eventos satélites de la conferencia, yo mencionaba de la sociedad civil, pero tuvimos una reunión de activistas del movimiento canábico de todo el hemisferio, tuvimos una reunión de campesinos y cultivadores de plantas consideradas ilícitas, tuvimos una reunión de personas que usan drogas y que reclaman su derecho de ser escuchados y de tener una voz en la definición de las políticas. Me parece que eso nos pone frente a un nuevo escenario y frente a un escenario que no podemos desconocer, no podemos, entiendo, negarnos a escuchar esas voces que han estado ausentes durante décadas del debate de políticas de drogas.
John?
It's a very good question. I think the one-word answer, initial answer, is in terms of obstacles or hurdles is fear. Fear on the part of the general public, because crime is such a visible problem, and in particular violent crime. And over now generations, we can even say the message that drugs are evil, wrong, bad, even the root of all evil. I mean, there's been a message that has been soaked up, in particular among fairly conservative societies that are going to would be reluctant to draw fine distinctions at this point. So it's a big public opinion challenge, as Graciela was saying, for a leader who is very clear that the current approach is not only not working, but is very negative. Public opinion is a big challenge because of the fear. I think there's two experiences that come to mind that could be helpful. One is the OAS report itself and the idea that the regional institution, the regional body is saying there is, to leaders, there is political space to pursue these. These are on the table. They ought to be on the table. This is about a much broader set of challenges than it is often boiled down to in public discourse. So there's some political backing and there's political space. And I think the experience that could be illustrative and helpful in understanding roads not to go down is precisely the United States. Where we are now is at the tail end of at least 4-decade incarceration boom with incredible costs, well beyond the fiscal costs, right? And the idea that our example, which we exported in many ways, both in bilateral relationships, but also at the UN level in terms of treaty commitments, the U.S. is shifting to a place after bearing many of those costs. My suggestion is that most countries shouldn't even contemplate taking on the costs that we did. I don't think we could afford it, and I really don't think smaller, less wealthy countries can afford it. And I think the United States now is in a position to say, we went down this road and we're taking a different path now. And I think there's some good evidence for why other countries should not try to embark on the same road and rather take a much more nuanced and diversified approach.
Jonathan, can I just mention two things, and I want to build off of what John previously spoke about. One is the conflation of drugs and crime. And in the United States, I can just speak about the experience in the United States. It comes from both the historical moment in time in the 1960s, 70s, and 80s when violent crime began to increase, and at the very same time, drug use of all kinds of cannabis, of cocaine, of opiates, were all increasing to historically high levels. That's part of it, but there was other evidence that brought crime and violence together. We had a program in the United States for quite some time where all people who were arrested for all kinds of crime in a number of jurisdictions were drug tested. And a very, very large percentage turned out to have used some illegal drug relatively recently and were tested and were found to be positive. There was also a very clear connection between gangs and other organizations involved in drug trafficking and violent crime in many, many neighborhoods, especially neighborhoods of color and neighborhoods that were less affluent. And so those connections were clearly made. I'm not sure that's the case all around the hemisphere, but it certainly was the case then. But the second thing I want to just build on again what John talked about, and that's measuring success, finding out what those measures are. And the Attorney General and the Justice Department completely agree with what John is saying, that it's not counting up the inputs, the number of arrests, the number of years incarceration, the number of cases prosecuted. But the key is finding those measures of success that are meaningful and that both the enforcers will find meaningful, but also the politicians and the public will find meaningful. So that's why, when I was talking, I mentioned our violent crime rate. Sometimes there's a disconnect between the violent crime rate and what our public perceives as the problem of crime, but it's important to put in front of them that the number of homicides in the United States actually has dropped by half. People are often very startled, and it's hard for them to actually see those historical changes over time. But there are other measures that we look to, and that I think there should be a great debate about what those measures are. But for example, there are surveys that are done of 8th, 10th, and 12th graders, high school students, about their use of alcohol and drugs. Those are very important indicators. Those are early indicators of what our drug problem will be in the years ahead. We have surveys of the general public on drug use. We have surveys on crime. We have, and I'm not suggesting any of those are the perfect measures, but I think John is right that the key is to find the measures that the public and the politicians will find meaningful, and to look to alternative strategies, just as the Attorney General is looking to an alternative strategy, not just enforcement to the highest order. But yes, enforcement is a part, but prevention is a part. Reducing reoffending by people who are coming out of prison is a part. Intervention programs is a part. And looking to those other strategies and then measuring whether they are successful. And what does it mean? Thinking through, what does it mean for those programs to be successful? We have found, for example, there's a program that was put together by a professor at John Jay College of Criminal Justice in New York, which was about intervening in drug markets that were associated with violence.
But the traditional approach was just arrest everybody. Let's go in, and I saw this firsthand in the 1980s in Oakland, where I practiced law a long time ago, where police officers would come in and they would walk in, undercover police officers would say, do you have any? And they would say, yes, I do. And they would say, how much? $20. They would hand a $20 bill. Someone would hand over a rock of cocaine. They would make a signal, and a bunch of police officers would swoop in and make arrests. And the theory then was, if I make enough of these arrests, that eventually the drug traffickers will dry up. There won't be any. Well, of course, that didn't turn out to be the case. But this alternative strategy put forward by Professor Kennedy at John Jay College suggests that if law enforcement goes in, does surveillance, and is ready to make arrests, but then instead of actually making the arrests, calls in all of those low-level traffickers and says, you know what, we've been watching you, and you've all, and we have evidence that you've been involved in this micro-trafficking, but we're going to give you a couple of alternatives because we care about the violence in your community. And by the way, it's not just enforcement people who are talking. It's members of the clergy. It's members of the community. It's those who are formerly incarcerated. And they present this, and they present two different alternatives. You can either be arrested, or we're going to provide you with an alternative path which will allow you, if you need treatment, because of course everybody doesn't need treatment. Everybody who's a drug user does not need treatment. But if you need treatment, we'll give you treatment. If you need job training, we'll give you job training. If you need other social services, we'll give you those social services. And it is a much lower cost approach. The number of arrests go down, but at the same time, the interventions can make a huge difference in a particular community and in reducing the violence. So it's a matter of, yes, coming up with new strategies, but making sure you have the measures of success that the community as a whole can agree upon. And we believe, and the Attorney General's Smart on Crime approach believes that you can reduce violent crime, you can reduce illegal drug use, which we still believe is very dangerous. Using methamphetamine and heroin is not a good thing. And you can reduce those things, but at a lower cost, at a lower use of incarceration, of criminal justice resources. Not none, but much, much lower and much more effective. But you have to agree on those measures. Thank you very much. Thank you to our panel. The floor is now open for any questions from our floor. Go right ahead.
Thanks a lot. Yes. Well, thanks a lot for this very interesting presentations. Yes, I'm the permanent observer of Italy, and talking about alternatives, I just wanted to mention also the Italian experience. There is something that's quite successful in Italy, and these are initiatives that are mainly managed by the Catholic Church. And these are initiatives for recuperating addicted people. And so instead of sending them back to jail each time the crimes connected to drug trafficking, what has been done in Italy is that, well, the police has confiscated the goods of the organized crime, and so these goods include large properties, fields. Just to make an example, there's Sant'Egidio that has a huge vineyards, and so these young people, these addicted, are sent in these big properties to work, and they have to follow a pretty tight regime. So it's not like they're in jail, of course. They just have to follow a tight regime and discipline, and be productive. So start a new life by producing something. Eventually they can start jobs. And so it's a way to recuperate them and to find, to start a new life. So this is quite successful. and it lowers of course, the occupancy of the jails. The jails are, and also reduces usually the number. I mean, a big problem I think with drug addicts that are incarcerated is that they repeat crime. So there's crime repetition. This has to do also with the low quality of jails. So what this alternatives is also a way to avoid them, to see this repetition of crimes enhanced. And so, I mean, Italy has some the other positive aspect is that you're able to avoid the mafia to take over again the goods the properties that they used to have. So there is also some other positive aspects to be taken into account. But because of this experience, so Italy has decided to co-finance one of the 4 pillars of the SICA, which is the security strategy in Central America. And it's the one dedicated to modernization of prisons and jails, but also to the reintegration into society of incarcerated people. So we're focusing a lot on women and young people. Usually they're connected, as you know, with drugs and things like that. And I think, unfortunately, we're probably the only donor that is doing that, because the other 3 pillars are far more popular. So the Western donors are focusing on those 3 pillars, and far less are doing that on modernization of jails and recuperation, integration of prisoners into society. And that's a struggle, of course. It's a struggle, and I hope, of course, the tendency will change. I could also mention another experience that is interesting but in Brazil there is Fiat that has a foundation that is right now supporting some jails that are not so tight, that haven't got the rules that jails have. So, and they're quite successful in reducing the number of crimes that are repeated. They see that people that go into this jail, the special jails, usually avoid repeating their crimes, and so this has a very positive effect. So it's interesting to see also what the private sector and the NGOs are doing in the various countries. That's my question. I'm sorry, I've been a bit too long. I just wanted to talk a bit about the Italian experiences. Thanks.
Thank you. Would any of our panelists like to respond? I think this was more of a comment than a question. Thank you very much. Any other questions from the audience? Don't be bashful.
Thank you very much for this very interesting set of presentations. I have a question for Judge Jackson Hazley and a question for the other 3 panelists. The question for Judge Jackson Hazley is, who do you think should bring about the change in the law that would bring about greater sensitivity on gender terms? Should it be the judges who should lead the way, or should it be the legislators who should bring about this change? And for the other panelists, I was wondering if in your analysis you make a distinction between cannabis use and the use of harder drugs. And if you do make that distinction, how does it play itself out in your analysis of how to deal with the problem of incarceration? Thank you.
Okay, well, if I may go first, one of the hallmarks of our system of government is the independence of the different powers. And so the issue of changes to legislation really does not reside with judges. And so I think that's really a matter, if it is to come from the statute, then clearly that's a matter for the legislators to deal with. However, I think that, there's some discretion in terms of what judges can do. And although we don't make recommendations in terms of changes to the law, there are different fora that persons attend that you can bring up these issues and the legislators may very well hear what is happening and may try to make changes in that regard. But I think also, though, that judges do have a wide discretion in terms of what they can do within their courts as it relates to sentencing, because sentencing incorporates, many different facets in terms of your considerations. What do you consider in the sentencing process? I mean, the Court of Appeal has made many remarks in this regard in terms of the fact that judges really should have social inquiry reports indicating all of the different nuances as it relates to this particular offender before proceeding to sentencing. And in fact, the Court of Appeal has stressed on many occasions that imprisonment is really a sentence of last resort. And I think in terms of making changes to the law, you do have from that very high level, certain cases that stipulate and guide judges in terms of how to approach certain issues. But in terms of how do we go about doing this on a more practical level, I think perhaps more sensitization, in more capacity building of judges, and where there's room within existing legislation to focus on gender, then we can do this. But when it comes to actually changing the law, then that is a matter for the legislators.
So first of all, if I can just touch on this, in the United States, in the federal criminal justice system, in the law that created the sentencing guidelines in the United States Sentencing Commission, it specifically stated that the sentencing guidelines shall be neutral as to gender. So if there is going to be a change at the federal level anyway, it is going to have to come through the legislature. Now, as to cannabis, in the United States, you know from reading the newspapers, in our 50 states, there is tremendous experimentation, innovation. I'm not sure what word we want to use, but a lot of things that are going on. Decriminalization, there's legalization, there's a lot of changes going on. At the federal level, there are almost no prosecutions for possession of marijuana, almost none. And if there are either none or there are literally a handful of people who are in federal prison because of marijuana possession. The vast majority of marijuana prosecutions in the federal criminal justice system are large quantities that are being transported, usually across the border. And so it is largely focused on trafficking of dozens of pounds of very large-scale amounts. So the approach of the Attorney General to those cases and also to federal law are the same, so that if you are a first-time nonviolent offender, you agree to provide the government with information about your case, you can also be excused from any mandatory minimum sentence that would be applied. I think the same principle holds even in cannabis cases at the federal level.
Sí, en relación a lo que señalábamos respecto de tener presente diferencias entre sustancias, el tema de cannabis quizás lo que genera es la posibilidad de pensar también alternativas en lo que hace a la producción y distribución. Y en ese sentido, el poder avanzar hacia situaciones de desincriminación del cultivo doméstico e incluso lo que las experiencias que estamos observando en varios países con los clubes sociales, es decir, agrupamientos de socios de una organización que producen para el propio consumo, avanzan un paso más allá de la sola desincriminación del consumidor, sino que están dando, entendemos, pueden dar una respuesta a las situaciones de producción y de distribución. Y por supuesto, en línea con lo que veremos de aquí a un tiempo, qué resultados trae, que son directamente la regulación de mercados con fuerte intervención estatal, como es el caso de la experiencia de Uruguay.
Yeah, just to add very little to that, what I guess in terms of the decriminalization, in other words, the possession or consumption of the substances declared illicit or illegal, it's whether it's cannabis or whether it's cocaine, as a rights issue and as the right to privacy, as the person's right to do that, free of becoming a criminal in the eyes of the law, that's irrespective of the drug. In our position, and I think Graciela's position, from a rights perspective. That's not to say that just because it's not against the law or that you can't be considered a criminal for doing it, that society or the law promotes it or condones it or wants you to do it. But that's a different matter, right? So it's saying that this is not an apt matter for criminal law, and far from it, it's contrary to someone's private right if they're not harming or involving a third person. Then the other issue comes to, yes, there are distinctions across substances, some more dangerous than others, and if the state is to opt for a legalized and regulatory role to effectively control and regulate, those distinctions would have to come to bear. For instance, if the state were to opt to make legal but regulate cocaine, you would assume some stricter rules would apply than for a less problematic, not unproblematic, but less problematic substance like cannabis. You can also imagine how the law could be used to where there are clear differences in danger associated with different substances. The law could be managed to, or at least aimed to steer users towards the less problematic substances. So if cannabis is, for instance, less dangerous net than alcohol, for instance, you should see also much more strict regulation about alcohol to ensure that if there is a psychoactive substance available and people will use psychoactive substances, they're opting for the ones that are less harmful overall. So a regulatory approach is not by any means a carte blanche approach. A regulatory approach makes distinctions and looks to reduce the harms associated with psychoactive use, but also reduce the unnecessary harms created by rules that can't be applied well or strictly prohibitionist. So I think in some cases the differences matter immensely. In another case, like the question of criminalization per se, then the difference is not important.
Thank you. Any other questions from our audience? One question.
Thanks a lot for the excellent presentation. We have many questions. Primero quisiera preguntar sobre cuáles serían las claves a tratar acerca de los efectos colaterales de las políticas antidrogas. O sea, cuando hablamos a luz de más de 30 años, focalizando las políticas antidrogas en las Américas, sobre todo a partir de la segunda administración de Ronald Reagan en 1986, vemos que muchas veces las políticas antidrogas que parten de la seguritización, la militarización, han traído efectos contraproducentes, no solamente en la región, sino incluso al interior de los Estados Unidos. Creo que debería vincularse más también con temas como la trata y el tráfico ilegal de personas. Viendo estos temas y las dinámicas que se ven hoy en la región de la apertura a la despenalización y legalización de algunas drogas como las drogas blandas, la marihuana en específico, ¿cuáles serían, digamos, las claves para lograr una liberalización de las drogas blandas, digamos la marihuana, en aquellos países de las Américas donde existen esas posibilidades, sin que esto traiga efectos secundarios hacia el crecimiento de la vulnerabilidad de la sociedad, del Estado de Derecho? O sea, creo que ahí habría que hacer un estudio más amplio, puesto que hay grandes diferencias en las diferentes regiones de las Américas. O sea, digamos, Sudamérica, Centroamérica o el mismo Caribe. O sea, con las últimas políticas antidroga hemos apreciado una reactivación de la ruta del Caribe, que era algo que se veía décadas atrás. Y creo que debemos pensar cuáles han sido los efectos secundarios de políticas antidroga como la propia Iniciativa Mérida hacia la explosión de nuevas rutas o de la dinamización de nuevos grupos de narcotraficantes que ya no son esos grandes cárteles, ¿no? Y creo que por ahí, viendo esas consecuencias, se pudieran, digamos que adecuar estas políticas a las realidades que tenemos hoy en la actualidad. O sea, si pudieran dar un breve comentario al respecto, estaría muy agradecido.
Thank you. I think that was somewhat more of a comment than a question, but I don't know if any of our panelists would like to respond. I think we have one more question.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Thank you to all the panelists for these extremely interesting and enlightening presentations. My question goes to violence and drug use. We've heard a lot today about how drug use can be a route for violence. And my question is to all the panelists, do you think perhaps that the criminalization of drugs in general has been a route for violence? And I'm going more towards violence due to drug trafficking more than drug usage.
Anyone want to take that one on?
Sure.
Jonathan?
I'll try to take it on. I mean, there's no question that a lot of in the United States anyway, and a lot of the violence associated with drugs is what's been called systemic violence, which is violence associated with the trafficking. And the fact that it's illegal means that the trafficking has to be, is often done on the streets, and it's often done without the protection of law, and so the protection has to come from the street. There's no question about that. Of course, what's the next thing you have to ask is what's the implication of that? And this gets to the whole legalization. It gets us to this whole question of legalization versus regulation and so forth. I think the challenge, and again, some of my colleagues mentioned this, which is that how does a government send a message to its people, and how do the people send messages to each other, and how as parents do we send messages to our children that when you're going to experiment with psychoactive substances, or when my wife and when I go home tonight and she pulls out a glass of wine, how do we find a way to do that in a safe way that's going to cause as little harm as possible? And our experience in the United States, because in the United States we have 200 years of experience. Beyond the United States there's much more experience. But in the United States we have 200 years of experience, and we've gone through cycles where we've said no, never, called prohibition, or sometimes it's called temperance. And then we've gone through other periods where we've said, fine, it's okay, let's experiment, let's try it out. In fact, not just that it's okay, but that an opiate can be beneficial, or taking cocaine can solve all kinds of respiratory problems, other physical problems, and can actually make you more productive. So we've gone through cycles, but that was not the panacea either. If it had been the panacea, we'd still be in that place. But it turns out if you send a message in your community that cocaine is fine, go ahead and try it, use will go up, and once use goes up, a certain percentage of the users will have a substance abuse disorder, and all kinds of other collateral effects will take place. So there are collateral effects both ways. And of course, the magic is finding the balance. And in the United States, finding that balance is very difficult because of the nature of our culture of swinging from extreme to extreme. And that's what we've done. And the last time we had, before the current war on drugs, we had a period of temperance. It ended up in putting in our Constitution that the sale of alcoholic beverages was contrary to the Constitution of the United States. I mean, think about how extraordinary that is. But we did that. Of course, we came to our senses eventually and took it out of our Constitution, and then had a period of permissiveness. But that also didn't particularly end well, and that's where we were in the 1960s and the 1970s, with greatly increased drug and alcohol use, and all kinds of negative collateral effects to that. Now, did we go too far the other way? Probably. And now it's time, after 40 years of the war on drugs, to go back a different way.
And that's what we're trying to do. And our challenge going forward is to find the proper balance and the proper measures so that we don't run to extreme, that we don't get to excessive use and excessive substance abuse disorder and rising crime and all the rest. And how we find that exact spot, I'm not sure, but I do agree, experimentation, innovation is the key. And I think that's starting to happen. But finding the right measures, doing it slowly, and not just saying we have to throw out the whole system. We have to change it, experiment, measure it, and find a better policy than what we have. And that's what we're trying to do in a measured and thoughtful way. Okay, I think we're coming to the end of our session, and we have one final question from Professor Toomey.
Sorry, Paul, I have three. Now, to Graciela, you mentioned that you expect the Latin Americans would go to UNGAS 2016 with an agenda or a joint program. Now, the last time they tried that about 6 weeks ago in Antigua, so it was impossible to arrive at an agreement simply because the problem of drugs in each country is different. It was not even possible to have the Bolivians support Uruguayans. Okay? So I wonder, I mean, since you're working on that, I'd like to know more about how likely it is that Latin Americans could actually come up with a joint position.
I think we're going to have to limit it to that question because we're short on time for the group. So, Graciela, you want to?
Por supuesto que en este proceso hay muchas situaciones de contradicción y de tensión y siempre insistimos en decir que así como no hay una posición única, homogénea, unívoca entre todos los países y entre todos los gobiernos de la región, tampoco la hay en la sociedad civil de la región. Y creo que acá es, con el ejemplo concreto que has planteado, es muy necesario el poder indicar y encontrar estos puntos que son un desafío en problemáticas muy diferentes. A ver, la experiencia de Bolivia en relación con la hoja de coca, el mascado y todo lo que eso ha significado es bien diferente, por ejemplo, de la experiencia de Uruguay. Sin embargo, hay puntos en común que merecerían profundizarse en una mesa de diálogo. Creo que desde algunos sectores de sociedad civil lo vemos con mucha claridad esto, no siempre lo vemos representado con la misma claridad en las mesas de diálogo entre gobiernos. Pero bueno, ahí está el aporte que pretendemos hacer.
Muchas gracias. I'd like to thank our panelists for an absolutely terrific presentation, and thanks to all of our audience for some very incisive questions. Let's give a big round of applause to our panelists. Ahora podría pedir al embajador Argueta de subir y dar unas palabras finales. Muchas gracias.
Muy buenas tardes a todos. No sé si está funcionando yo me quiero sumar también al agradecimiento a los panelistas por parte de estas pocas palabras. Creo que son ustedes una muestra de la diferencia carencia de perspectiva que existe no solo en el hemisferio americano, sino en el mundo en relación al tema que nos ocupa. Comparto que no podemos ver ninguno de los elementos del problema de manera aislada. El problema tenemos que verlo de una manera integral y tenemos que hacerlo desde la perspectiva, en una sobresimplificación si se quiere. La razón del Estado, la razón de existir del Estado, es crear las condiciones para que las personas puedan realizarse como tales. Los países del hemisferio estamos ahora en consecuencia embarcados en un esfuerzo por producir, por formular una posición hemisférica frente al problema mundial de las drogas, poniendo al centro de las políticas a la persona humana. Pero también entendemos que esta política tiene que recoger la preocupación de todos los Estados miembros. Nosotros no vemos el impulso de Guatemala como un deseo, por ejemplo, de Guatemala de presentar su visión en relación al problema de las drogas. Guatemala está haciendo un esfuerzo por capturar el espíritu de las preocupaciones de todas las delegaciones que en este momento, todavía en este momento, están abajo con otro tema que es de singular importancia, que es el tema de la visión estratégica de esta organización. ¿Qué queremos de ella? Es decir, todas estas cosas no podemos verlas de manera aislada. Yo creo personalmente que el hecho de que estemos reunidos acá en este debate, en esta reflexión alrededor del problema de las drogas, es ya un paso adelante. Este es un tema que, de nuevo, sobresimplificándolo, pareciera ser que la política de drogas que en este momento rige el actuar de los gobiernos del hemisferio se basa en la hipótesis de que si reducimos la oferta se reduce la demanda. Bueno, eso parece que no dio los resultados que anticipábamos. Entonces, nos podríamos ir al otro lado, al otro extremo y decir, bueno, entonces lo que tenemos que hacer es reducir la demanda, y al reducir la demanda reducimos el incentivo de producir, porque los precios se desplomarían con una demanda extraordinariamente pequeña y si se mantienen los niveles de oferta actuales. Bueno, ninguna de esas cosas funciona. Entonces, para aquellos que tienen altas expectativas en lo que va a ser la Asamblea Especial en Guatemala, déjenme decirles que difícilmente sus expectativas van a alcanzarse como no se alcanzan las de ninguna persona en particular. Tenemos que extrapolarnos. Tenemos que dejar de pensar en yo soy guatemalteco, tú eres argentina, tú eres norteamericano. Tenemos que empezar a pensar en que somos ciudadanos de un hemisferio y que el hemisferio puede en este momento presentar una posición común frente al mundo en el tema del problema mundial de las drogas. Creo que paneles como este llevan luz a las conversaciones. Creo que la Organización de Estados Americanos, de la mano con el gobierno de Guatemala, en el lanzamiento del concurso colaborativo La Voz de la Juventud de las Américas, en donde le preguntamos a los jóvenes del hemisferio cómo los impactan las drogas, qué esperan ustedes que sus gobiernos hagan en relación a las drogas y cuáles son los consejos que ustedes nos dan, nos presenta frente a una alternativa que no se había ensayado nunca en el tema de las drogas, que es consultarle al grupo poblacional mayormente expuesto al problema de las drogas. Antes de reunirnos acá con ustedes, conversábamos con el profesor y él me decía, en Estados Unidos hay una brecha generacional. Todos los mayores de 40 años ven el tema de una manera diferente a la percepción que tienen aquellos jóvenes que son menores de 40 años. Bueno, ¿eso qué quiere decir? ¿Quiere decir que los jóvenes estos ahora tienen 39 años, cuando tengan 41 van a pensar distinto? Creo que no. Creo que son diferentes realidades y creo que las expresiones que ustedes nos están presentando ahora enriquecen esa percepción. Me hubiese gustado que este panel se hubiese dado hace unos cuantos meses cuando empezamos esta conversación, pero en aquel momento todavía no era posible. Ahora es posible. Yo creo que no los gobiernos del hemisferio, cuya responsabilidad básicamente es la de armonizar la respuesta del Estado, Estado con E mayúscula, al problema mundial de las drogas. La respuesta no podemos ofrecerla a los gobiernos aisladamente. La respuesta tenemos que encontrarla entre todos, ciudadanos y gobiernos, sociedad civil y gobierno, entidades académicas, sociedad civil y gobierno. Y creo que en ese esfuerzo estamos embarcados los que acá, ante la Organización de los Estados Americanos, representamos a los gobiernos del hemisferio. Creo que es un esfuerzo serio, creo que es un esfuerzo concienzudo y creo que es un esfuerzo que al final nos va a dar la formulación de una política hemisférica de drogas que nosotros nos sintamos cómodos todos de empoderarnos de ella y llevarla al seno de la Asamblea General de Naciones Unidas en el 2016. Tengamos esperanza, el camino no es fácil, pero creo que todos hemos ido comprendiendo poco a poco, no de alcanzar un compromiso por alcanzar un compromiso, sino de alcanzar un compromiso para dar una solución al problema. Muchas gracias.
Bueno, gracias de nuevo por todo nuestro panel y por ustedes su presencia. Muy amable.
Necesita el link.
¿Ya terminó ya?
Voy a volar la especialista.